Alright, so hello everyone, this is Keko Demon Tube, and today I am interviewing Randy Linden. He is the programmer and one of the creative minds behind Super Nintendo Doom. How's it going, Randy?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great as well. Alright, so tell us something about yourself. How did you start? Little summary.
I started very early on. My first game was published when I was 13. It was called Bubbles. It was on the Commodore 64, and it was all written in 6502 machine code. Back then, for microcomputers, there wasn't a C language, there wasn't an assembler, there wasn't a linker, so you had to know all of the 6502 opcodes and carefully place your code at nice even addresses in memory. It was published as I said, it was called Bubbles. It's Centipede style game, but it was all underwater. And then I worked on a couple of well-known programs for the Commodore 64 as part of what was a Commodore 64 Office suite. I worked on the database program called Paperback Filer. And the trio was from a company called Digital Solutions, and they made Paperback Office. It had a word processor, a database, and a spreadsheet, and it was first on the Commodore 64 and then on the Commodore 128. And after that, I worked on a program called the 64 Emulator for Amiga. And then after 64 Emulator for Amiga came Dragon's Lair for Amiga, and then I worked on Doom for the Super Nintendo.
Alright, nice. And I believe you also made Bleem later, right?
That's correct. After that I did Bleem for the PC, and then I worked on Bleem Cast for the Dreamcast.
Oh yeah, I've seen a few of those lurking around the internet, like on eBay and stuff. I've always wanted to have one because I'm a collector as well. So.
Oh, if you're well, okay. After this, send me your address, and I'll be happy to send you a bunch of some Bleem stuff that I've got. I've got some stickers. I've got some Bleemcast discs. I've got some Spanish version of Bleem for PC. I'd be happy to send you
Oh, that's so great.
A care package for collectors. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I like to preserve as much as possible the rich history of video games.
Yes, it's really important.
It is. It's very important. Things change so rapidly. The number of collectors that are out there is very small.
Yeah.
And the number of games and the gaming technology is so vast that I think it's important to sort of spread it around so that as many people as possible have access to it. And so, yes, I'd be very, very happy to send you a care package of goodies.
Oh, that's very awesome. Thank you very much, Randy.
Oh, you're very welcome.
If how did you start at Sculptured Software, and what was your story there and stuff? Did you have any fun stories and how it all happened?
Yep, sure. I had started work at Sculptured Software in my 20s, and I was actually starting work on a monster truck rally game with big sprites, and as happens often in the video game industry, sometimes games get canceled. And while I was working on the monster truck game, I was also helping out a friend. His name was John Morgan, who was working on a game called Dirt Tracks FX. And as you could tell from the FX, it was using the Super FX. We had both seen Star Fox, and we knew that the Super Nintendo with the Star Fox cartridge, with the chip that was inside the Star Fox cartridge, was capable of doing three-dimensional graphics, but there was no development system from Nintendo. So we had basic hardware documentation, but no way of actually developing any software on it. So a company was hired to make what's called a breadboard. It was basically about about a half a sheet of paper big, sort of like about this big, and on it were all the chips for RAM and a dissected SuperFX cartridge. So they just dissected the SuperFX cartridge and dismounted the ROM and replaced it with the RAM and a little tiny boot ROM. And in the boot ROM, I put a bootloader and wrote a software on the Amiga that connected to the Super Nintendo over the parallel port. So you plugged in one end into the parallel port, and a cable came out, and it ran into the joystick connectors on the Super Nintendo. So I could communicate back and forth between the Amiga and the Super Nintendo. And I wrote an assembler and a linker and a source level debugger that was used to develop DirtTrax FX. And while that was being developed, I started playing around with the SuperFX and wrote a texture mapper. And at that time, there was available online all sorts of documentation about Doom and its internal formats. And so I started writing a set of tools that would basically take the Doom data from the PC version and convert it into a format that my engine that I was working on slowly would use. A lot of the that's one of the reasons why the Super Nintendo version is so faithful to the PC version, because literally I take the same data that runs on the PC and I run it through my tool chain, and it then becomes converted for use with my engine.
Yeah, that's true, because most of them use the Atari Jaguar port as a reference, and then you don't have the bosses, you don't have crushers, and a lot of textures are different in the Jaguar version. It's more brown and stuff, and that's so interesting about your port. It was all like completely different. It had levels that the other versions didn't even have until like the Xbox versions or something. You know, that
yes,
really interesting.
Well, it took a lot of work, and it's something that I've kept up to this day. I had worked on Nintendo 8-bit and Super Nintendo and a lot of systems that didn't have a lot of memory. They didn't have a lot of ROM. They didn't have a lot of RAM.
Yeah.
So I got used to doing an awful lot of extra work to make sure that everything was highly compressed, and that compression allowed me to have many more textures, wall textures. It allowed me to have many more levels, all within the same space. The Super Nintendo cartridge is only 2 megabytes big.
That's really small.
It's yes. These days, games take up to a gigabyte.
Even more.
Or even more. And back then, Doom on the Super Nintendo, with its levels and the bosses and all of that. Now, there were compromises made, of course, but it's a Super Nintendo. And compared to the more powerful systems, I think it came out pretty good.
It really did. It really did.
Well, thank you.
Well, anyway, so my next question was: we know that John Romero that the SNES port began development without its software being aware of it at all. But what did they think of it? How did you propose this project to them?
Well, this is a good question, because if at the time you said to somebody, I'm going to make Doom on the Super Nintendo and it's going to use the SuperFX, people wouldn't believe you. They would have just laughed and said, yeah, there's no way that's going to be possible. So I knew that, and I actually worked to get a functional prototype so that you could literally, now the monsters weren't in yet, but the world was there. You could run around the world. It was E1, M1, and you could immediately see that it was Doom running on the Super Nintendo on the special cartridge.
So it had all like textures and you could open doors and stuff? Was that all in there? Oh,
yes.
That's awesome. And it also status bar, like, was that there?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah. So it was a very advanced prototype.
Yeah, you could say that. But how? So you showed it to them, and what was their reaction?
They were stunned. They were very surprised. They looked at it and they said, "Yes, this is. There's no question. This is Doom.
Yeah.
That it's definitely something we have to pursue." And they then contacted id Software and spent a lot of time working between id Software and Nintendo to get permission for a lot of the unique aspects of Doom, like the graphics and the blood and the degree of violence, and it was very, very unique.
So Nintendo was like they all figure it was all handled by its software and Williams and Sculpted Software to get all the things in, because Nintendo was very cautious with all those things like blood and religious imagery and stuff. So is there anything more that can be said about that?
I think that Nintendo really worked with Sculptured and id Software, and I know that Williams worked very hard to really make the Doom on the Super Nintendo a very special project. A good example is the fact that it's got the 3 levels, that it's got, the 3 episodes, that it's got the violence, it's got the blood, it's got all the original textures. None of that had to be changed or modified. It's got the music, it's got the sound effects. I think Nintendo was very pleased with the port, especially compared to their competitors.
Yeah, I would think that.
And so I think that Nintendo was more willing to be flexible and work out with Williams and id and Sculptured to allow these things that were unprecedented.
Yeah, but because it was something Nintendo could brag about, like we have more levels than the 32X version or the Atari Jaguar version. So it was like maybe they had like some kind of benefit for themselves with this.
Yes, exactly. It's out of the compromises that were made. One of them that was early on was that we wanted to stay as true to the PC version as possible. And so that's why, as I said, there's a set of tools that basically process the Doom data from the PC. And so that's why I've noticed in some of the other ports, like in E1, M1, they're missing some of the steps.
Yeah, or the pillars or something.
Or the pillars are gone, things like that. And I didn't have to make any of those modifications. We could literally take the levels exactly as they were, run them through the tools, and there they were on the Super Nintendo. It just worked out easily. I know that this is going to be good news for the people that have hacked around with the cartridge, especially later on with a surprise about the Doom source, and I know you had a question about that, and it's going to make a lot of people happy to find out that these tools and things are going to become available.
Yeah, they really are. What was the most difficult part?
I think that it's a good question. There were 2 or 3 areas that were difficult. One of them was fitting things in. The space limitations predominantly drove a lot of the decisions. A number of people that we'll get to in the Q&A from the fans, a lot of people asked, how did you decide what to cut? And a lot of the decision was based on the size of the levels. I wanted the port to have the most levels possible. Mm-hmm. So if I cut one big level, it usually let me fit in 2 smaller levels.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so that there was a space issue, And there was the general overhead issue. This was my first Super Effects game, and while it was optimized, I wish I could have spent more time doing further optimizations and maybe get another level in, or improve the enemy logic. It's always possible to improve things like that. But if I remember correctly, when you build the entire game, there was something like 8 or 16 bytes available. It was literally packed full of content. Yeah, the engine itself mostly ran on the Super Effects. The vast majority of it, I would say 95% of the program was Super Effects.
But how did it? Why was the you used an hacked up Star Fox 1 cartridge, but that used the Super FX 1 chip?
Yes.
What?
And it ran at half the speed. It literally ran. It did. It ran at half the speed because the Super FX 1 chip only ran at, I want to say, 14. Or I think it was 14 point something megahertz, and the Super FX 2 chip was 20 something megahertz. So yes, the initial version ran at half the speed. But even at half the speed, you could see that it was Doom.
There aren't a lot of Super FX 2 games. There was the cancelled Star Fox 2, which just recently got a release on the Nintendo mini consoles. But then you had like Yoshi's Island, which didn't really use 3D a lot.
Yep.
And you had that Winter Gold game. I don't know if you've heard of that. It was like a European exclusive, and it used the Super FX 2 chip for its environments. It was like a winter skiing game. Anyway, my next question is... the SNES Doom supported online multiplayer over XBAND. What's the story behind that? I mean, there were also some Doom Guy sprites that I found when messing with the values in the game, and it's really funny to see that happen. And I was always wondering, what's the story? How did the deal come through with Catapult Software that wants to make XBAND? Can you tell anything about that?
Yes, I can. I always wanted on the box. I wanted to have as many of those little icons, like, you know, the Super FX logo and the mouse logo and the Super Scope logo. I wanted our box to have as many of those as I could possibly fit. So the game works with the Super Scope, the game works with the mouse, the game has the Super FX, and I wanted it to work with XBAND. So I got in contact with Catapult Software, and they sent over development hardware and all the technical specifications so that Doom actually runs one-on-one multiplayer over the XBAND modem, and the Doom Guy sprites that have the full rotations are actually used properly.
There's only like 2 videos on YouTube about it. I mean, I'd really recommend you watch them too. It's like old VHS footage of XBAND and Doom, and it's really interesting to see. You have this level voting system. Do you remember anything of that?
Yes, because and there was a timeout because you had to pick which level you were going to play.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh man, that's so awesome.
XBAND, yes, all of the code and a lot of the technical information about the XBAND is present in the source archive. And you can actually configure, there's a configuration file in the source code that says what to include and what to turn on and what to turn off. And
like monsters or objects, or what?
Well, things like, most people know that the horizontal texture mapping is double pixeled, but you can turn that off so that it's only single pixeled. And this is back on actual Super FX hardware, it would make the game run slower, but on an emulator, it won't, because the emulator is running much faster than the Super FX normally runs anyways. So you can turn on some of these extra features, like I said, like the single width textures for the walls, and turn on XBAND support, and
Yeah.
things like that.
Maybe we could make maybe people could make a like a PC version of the Doom multiplayer on the Reality Engine. I don't know. Maybe there's all kinds of possibilities. Who knows? I mean, I'm just guessing.
Well, but what is possible is if people have Doom levels. I guess we'll sort of give it away now. I'm going to be releasing the source code, and source code for Doom, and the source code for the tool chain. Now, the tool chain runs on Amiga, so you'll need an Amiga or an emulated Amiga, and it needs the Aztec C compiler, but the whole tool chain for the development, an assembler, a linker, a source level debugger, plus all of the Doom code, including the XBAND support. You can compile it for the different regions, American, European, or Japanese version. So you could literally take the tool chain, and if somebody wanted to make their own levels, they could make their own levels using, for example, DoomEd or any of the editors that are out there, and run those through the tool chain, and they would work on the cartridge that was then built.
Yeah, that's really amazing. I'm really looking forward to the source code release and the tools and stuff. I mean, it's really amazing stuff. Thank you so much for doing this all for the fans.
My pleasure. It's just finalizing the license, and then I have to write a little tiny tool that glues the license on top of each of the source files. But it will be at github.com/Randall Linden, RANDALLINDEN. And I've set up the repositories, and I'm currently working on getting, like I said, getting the license finalized, and then getting all the files updated so they've got the license there. But even just for poking around, if people are curious about how certain things work, and they're not interested in actually building the game, it's I think a good example of SuperFX code.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll put the GitHub in the description of the video, so they'll get so they can go check it out. All right. And my next question is: were there any other plans for your custom engine in the future, like on another console? Was like Doom 2 or like Duke Nukem 3D like proposed one time, or was it all too late, like in the lifespan of the Super Nintendo, or what?
Yeah, you're right. It was possible, and we were looking at the fourth episode. We were looking at a Doom 2, but it sort of came at the very, very end of the Super Nintendo's life cycle, and so the plans were sort of cut short because Williams and the other publishers figured that people wouldn't be that big a fan. If they could get Doom, then would they really want Doom 2? And at that time, PCs were picking up faster and faster as far as user base goes, and the Super Nintendo was starting to fall off. So there were plans, but they didn't really come to fruition.
But maybe we can now, with these tools, we can now make Doom 2 or Duke Nukem. I don't know. Maybe we can even make a conversion of like another game. Who knows? Maybe we can make a completely new game with the engine.
As long as the levels and the data are in the typical WAD format, then the tool chain just rips it apart. And it doesn't really know and doesn't really care. There's nothing specific in it about this level or that episode. It just says, okay, I'm going to take the data and I'm going to rip it apart, and I'm going to convert it into the format that the Reality Engine uses. So you could literally take any hand-created levels, and if they ran in Doom, then they'll run in the Reality Engine.
All right. So is it Rage/Reality Engine, or is it like one or the other? What?
It was both. Rage was a shorthand for, I forget exactly what it was, but the letters RAGE were Reality Advanced Gaming Engine. And
Yeah.
I got tired of saying all those words, so I just called it the Reality Engine.
Yeah, all right. So my next question is, all right, the fourth episode was already explained. Were there any differences in the prototype that went unused, like graphical elements that had to be scaled back in the final release because they made the game unstable, like floor textures, window textures, or effects like the Spectre Demon?
Okay, well, the engine does, as they said, support some advanced features that were typically disabled or removed due to the technical limitations. Mostly size was the issue. For example, the wall textures are stored in a compressed format. Both the wall textures and the objects and the monsters, where I compressed the textures vertically, but floor textures couldn't be compressed. So they had to be stored as 64 by 64 pixel blocks, which takes up a lot of space in the cartridge. So the first things to go were the floor textures. And I wrote, as part of the tool, it calculates the average color of the floor texture, and that's the color that entire floor span is rendered in. Now, the Doom Super Effects chip supports dithering. So if I wanted to do a blue, it could actually dither to get like a medium blue instead of just a solid blue color.
Yeah, that's true. You see that also in the game, where how that it gets darker in the distance, and you see that dithering that you're talking about. I believe that's it, right?
Yes, that's exactly it. The Super Effects chip could automatically do dithering, and the distance effect was based on the same kinds of palette tricks that Doom on the PC used, where I remapped the palette based on the brightness level of the given sectors, and as it got further away, the darkness level increases, and it just remaps things automatically. So it just sort of, it looks good, and it comes for free basically because the Super Effects chip can do a lot of that dithering for me. I don't have to do a lot of calculations there.
How long did the reality programming take of the reality engine?
I would say that it was about 6 months, give or take, to complete. There's a lot of parts to the engine. There's the tools, like I said, the assembler, the linker, the debugger for the Super Effects.
Yeah.
Towards the end, Nintendo had an official development system, and they loaned it to us. But instead of converting all of the source code from assembly that was in a format that my tools used, I basically converted the interface between the Amiga so it can communicate with the Super Nintendo, Nintendo's official development system. It was a huge box.
Yeah, like a computer or something.
Yes, it was. It was like a computer, and it had a SCSI interface. And so I had to reverse engineer the Super Nintendo's development system.
Yeah.
But it had a built-in Super FX 2 chip.
All right.
So that was nice, and everything ran at the full and correct speed.
Yeah.
So there was that. There was all of the tools to do the data conversion. There was all the sound. There was the music. There were a number of artists that worked on things like cleaning up the Doom Guy status bar, the different logos, the title screens, the title pages, all of that kind of stuff. So there was a whole team of people, as you can see from the credits.
Yeah.
That worked on the game. It was while I did the programming, there was a lot of other people that were involved. Like I, for example, didn't do the sound programming. That was done by Sculptured.
Yeah.
But the rest of it I did.
And yeah, coincidentally, I have now a question about the credits. Like this may be a little bit silly, but in the games there was this if you reset it 3 times or something, you get like a part of the credits, and then if you reset it another 3 times, you get the other part. But it had all these like peculiar occupations, and
Yes.
I was wondering like what. For example, Doom is My Life. That occupation was like the one that stuck out to me.
Yes.
John Coffey. What was that all about? Why?
Okay. Well, the credits weren't actually meant to be hidden. I had made it so that the credits didn't appear on the first couple of resets, because whenever somebody was playing and they didn't get very far and they died, they would just hit reset, and after the second or third time, the credits would appear. But I just chose different titles because I wanted everything to sound and to be unique for the game. So there's architects, and there's plumbers, and there's electricians, and it's sort of like you're building a house, and you have all the people that work on the different parts of the house. But John Coffey was a programmer who worked at Sculptured Software, who was a Doom fanatic. He knew every secret, everything in every level. He was like our primary tester, and he actually made some modifications that I thought were very, very cool to the original Doom levels that I thought made them play better. So we had done a version of the game where we've got these levels and they've been modified, and we showed them to id Software, and id Software said, no. We wanted it to be as close to the original PC as possible, so I had to undo all those changes. And the one thing they did let me keep is the rotating map.
Yeah, that was something. It was really famous of the Super Nintendo version. It had that Mode 7 effect, right?
Yes, exactly. And it wasn't actually done in Mode 7. It was still done with the super effects.
Oh, that's awesome. Like, that's something... Yeah. I didn't know that.
Yeah, the super effects I was actually drawing all the lines and everything. Yeah, so it wasn't using Mode 7 for that.
My next question is, the Japanese version of the game for the Super Famicom was published by Imagineer. I've heard from someone that the Japanese version has simplified English at the story text screens after you beat the boss of a specific episode. What's the story behind the Japanese release of Super Nintendo Doom, and how did it all work out? How did Imagineer reach out, or were there other publishers on board?
Well, actually, that was Sculptured. Sculptured arranged the different publishers. And Imagineer was the Japanese publisher, and I forget who was the European publisher. It might have
Ocean.
It was Ocean.
Yeah.
But I did the actual programming changes. So I had 3 different title screens, one for Williams, one for Imagineer, one for Ocean, and in the program I just told it, build the European version, and it automatically knew to use this particular title screen instead of the other ones. There were many changes for the European or Japanese versions, but one of them was the restriction. Well, there was the auto map. Yes, that was a feature. The Japanese version was deemed to be too difficult. So that's why, and now that I'm remembering this, that's why you could play all the 3 episodes on any of the skill levels. But the American and the European versions were closer to the original PC version, and weren't deemed to be too difficult, so that's why you had to be on the higher difficulty levels to play the later episodes. Yeah, you would think that it would be the exact same version for each of the different regions. But no, Nintendo really knows their audience, and they said that the game is too difficult for Japanese players who would be frustrated if they couldn't play all 3 episodes on the easy skill level. And so those kinds of compromises, we just trust Nintendo. They know what they're doing. I mean, obviously, they're Nintendo.
Yeah,
so
of course.
They really know what they're doing. And if they said that it was too difficult and this needed to be changed or that needed to be changed, then of course that's what we did.
And but what about the auto map? It had like this thing where you could see the monsters walking towards you, and you could spot them like on the auto map. It was really interesting. But why was that only in the Japanese version, I wonder?
The same version, the same reason that the version was made easier. It was a decision to make it easier for the Japanese market, because Nintendo had told us, and Ocean had said, that the Japanese game needs to be easier than the American version.
Imagineer, right? Or
yes, pardon me. Imagineer.
Yes,
you're right.
I'm just checking. The Super Nintendo version has been praised for its PC accuracy and the Cyber Demon and all that. That's all included. But it's also been criticized for the low frame rate and downgraded resolution and graphics. So it's hard to see enemies from a distance. But did you read or see the reviews back in the day? And do you occasionally still look up like reviews of it on YouTube to see how people think about it nowadays?
Yes, I both am interested and read the reviews from back in the day and the later reviews. As a developer, sometimes the projects that I work on are much more technical, and it's more of a technical achievement. So for me, that I think there's a lot of satisfaction in that. The SNES Doom really pushed the limits of the hardware, and when people were comparing it to the 32X or to the Jaguar, that are much more powerful machines, the fact that they were even comparing it rather than saying this just sort of stands alone because these machines are twice as powerful or 10 times more powerful, it was quite an honor that they were even being compared to those other versions. The frame rate and the lower resolution were due to hardware limitations of the super effects, but the fact that the game it's playable, it's Doom, and it's got the most levels of the cartridge ports that are out there, and it's got all the bosses, and I think that really sort of speaks for itself. That I was able to fit all that in with different compromises, like the distance-based lighting works, and it's got the rotating auto map, and it's got the most number of levels. I think that is a good balance considering what the Super Effects allows the Super Nintendo to do. It is a basic machine architecture compared to its competitors, and the fact that I think the port came out in many ways better than the other ones. Now, yes, it would have been great to have higher resolution and a higher frame rate, but I don't know that I would be willing to trade that if it meant fewer levels or if it meant cutting out a boss. I think that you miss part of the game, part of the longevity of the game, and so I think that it came across pretty good. And yes, I do still hear reviews that some of them are just awful. Some of the reviews are just awful, but they're, especially the more recent ones, they're by people who I think never lived through the era of the Super Nintendo when Star Fox came out, and it was heralded as a breakthrough in technology, which it is. Every time there was something new that was coming out, like I remember Virtua Fighter on the Sega side, it was like, wow, this is the 3D game, and Virtua Racing, and they're just, I think there are certain milestones in the history of video games that to take a look at Doom today and say, here's all the different versions of it, and let's just compare them directly. I think that it's a little bit unfair, but if you want to play the best version of Doom, then, you know.
I do admit there are also a lot of people who review it and say it's like a technical achievement for the time, and they say the arguments you say right now, like back in the day, it was like amazing to see 3D, even when it was Virtual Fighter, when it wasn't even textured and stuff. It was very low poly, but it was 3D, and it was all people wanted back then. It was, and it didn't really matter about the frame rate or the resolution, I would think, right?
Exactly. Well, that's the thing about Star Fox, and I haven't seen Star Fox 2, but I'm dying to see it. Star Fox was shown to a Nintendo Developer Conference. Nintendo once a year had a special developer conference, and they flew everybody flew up to Nintendo in Washington. Yeah. And at the premiere of the Super FX chip, when they announced it to everybody, they showed Star Fox. And Star Fox received a standing ovation from a room full of Nintendo developers. Yeah. It was just something that was so spectacular, so unbelievable, and so polished that it really it was sort of like Super Mario 64. It's one of those games that you just sort of have to step back and say, here's a moment in history. There's Wolfenstein, there's Doom, there's Virtua Fighter, there's Virtua Racing, there's Star Fox, there's a handful of games that really sort of pushed the envelope and moved the entire industry forward. And I don't know that Super Nintendo Doom is one of those games, but it certainly is up there in the technical achievement aspects of it, and so I'm proud of that.
Yeah, it's also about the Super FX. It's like Nintendo, like, revealed that I would think that it was like a big diss to Atari and Sega, because they had all these add-ons, and Nintendo, you just had the cartridge, and it was like a little more expensive, but I mean it could do most of the things that the 32X could do, and that needed an add-on and extra power.
Exactly. The 32X was this huge piece of hardware.
Yeah.
That you had to plug in to get that kind of power. Yeah. And while it was more powerful, it was very difficult to program. And the Super FX was much more like a RISC processor. It is a RISC processor, very similar to the ARM processors. So it was a simple instruction set. It was very logically laid out. It is one of my all-time favorite processors. Not that I have lots of favorite processors, but Super FX is one of those where they really put a lot of thought into the design of the chip, and that in and of itself was critical in both Star Fox and Doom. If the chip didn't have some of the features that it did, it's got an onboard cache, for example. It's got a plot command that does the automatic conversion from a pseudo bitmap into character mode that's used on the Super Nintendo. It really had all of the necessary pieces to make 3D games possible, and it was in a teensy tiny little piece of silicon that's just spectacular.
It's amazing, I gotta say. And like a little question here, what's the story behind the awesome red cartridge the USA release had?
Yes, it is a fantastic cartridge. I had no idea that Williams was doing that. It was a surprise to me. Williams arranged for it. I think it looks awesome. It stands out.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. There's only 2 other games I think that have custom cartridge colors.
Yeah, there was Maximum Carnage, was like the Spider-Man game, and there was
Yes.
Killer Instinct with a black cartridge.
Yes.
Really awesome, yeah. You can easily see them. If someone has a collection of like all the Super Nintendo games, you can easily spot Doom and the Maximum Carnage and Killer Instinct immediately. It's awesome.
Yes, exactly. It was a tremendous surprise and quite an honor. I think it really made it stand out as well that this game is special.
Yeah.
It's so special. It's so unique. It's got its own color cartridge, which is just wonderful.
If you could go back in time, you've also like explained what you would have done if you had more time, right?
Yep, I would. If I had more time, I think I would improve the compression. There is a book called the Doom Black Book, written by Fabian Sanglard. Excellent author. And Appendix I in the book is an interview he did with me about how Doom works. Doom for the Super Nintendo. You can actually go on Amazon, and if you look for that book by Fabian Sanglard, you can actually do a preview of the book, and you can scroll down and you can read all of Chapter I, and it tells all about how the technology for Doom Super FX works. Most people don't realize this, but the Doom screen is actually 3 pieces glued together, and the way it generates them is it generates the 3 pieces, but there's only enough RAM to store 5 pieces total, not 6, because there's 3 pieces that are shown, and if there was enough RAM for 3 more pieces, then I could just generate 3 pieces and swap them. But instead, what has to happen is there's 3 pieces that are being currently shown to make the whole screen from top to bottom. There are 2 pieces off screen that I generate, and then I wait for the raster to be at the top of the screen, and I start generating the 3rd piece into one of the 3 that's currently being shown. So the timing is very, very tricky, and then as soon as it's finished, it swaps 2 out of the 3 pieces, and it gets double buffering. It's like I said, a very complicated process that's described in detail in that Appendix I in that Doom Graphics Black Book. But I would have liked the opportunity to optimize some things further. I would have liked to add another level or 2. And I think with some improved compression, that would have been possible. But we had a tight timeline, and there's most people don't know that there are manufacturing lead times. When you order, you have to order your cartridges from Nintendo, and Nintendo does their quality, assurance testing, and then they manufacture the cartridges, and it takes between 6 weeks to 2 months or longer for the cartridges to come in. So the timeline in order to complete the game and have it available for the Thanksgiving holiday and for Christmas was too tight to do the additional work necessary.
Yeah, I could understand that. And also about there was no save battery in the game. Why was that?
This is a little known fact that Nintendo has different configurations of cartridges depending on what hardware it is and how big your ROM is. The cartridge that we used was the second most expensive cartridge Nintendo had. The only thing that would have been even more expensive was if there was a battery in the save RAM. If we added the battery of the save RAM, it would have increased the cost of the cartridge by another $5, $6, $7. And so the decision was made to leave the battery off of the cartridge. But that, yes, Doom is the second most expensive cartridge that Nintendo was providing to developers.
I bet there aren't really a lot of them that. Maybe Yoshi's Island, because that had the save battery. That
had the save battery, yes, it did. It had the save battery. Yeah, it used the most expensive cartridge, assuming that they used the full 16 megabit ROM.
Yeah.
Because you could choose to use an 8 or a 4 or a 16, and Doom used the 16 megabit ROM.
Now, we're going to the fan questions. So,
okay.
Here is a question. I cannot pronounce the name, but he asks, so far as I get, all the enemies have the same AI bounce off the walls like a ping pong ball animation and occasionally make monster noises. What was the reason behind it? Is there any explanation on?
There isn't actually a pattern. What the monsters really do is they just move towards the player.
Yeah.
And they aim towards the player, and if they hit a wall, they bounce off the wall in the appropriate direction. So it's not like Doom, where in Doom there's a zigzag.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, and he also asks, why do the monsters have holes in them in the emulators, but are perfectly fine for console? Is this a FX chip quirk?
Yes, it's an excellent observation. Most people don't notice this, but the emulators have a bug in their implementation of the Super FX chip that causes these graphic glitches. My suspicion is that they don't know that the Super FX, when it's fetching opcodes, it always fetches one opcode ahead and executes it. And even if you're doing loops, after the loop instruction that says go back to the top of the loop, the very next instruction is always executed. Well, the monsters are stored with compression, and the decompression logic has opcodes that are expected to be executed after they do the looping. And so my guess is that it's a software bug in the emulators and their implementation of the Super FX chip. Because when you run it on the actual hardware, the game works perfectly. Now, there is one emulator that does it correctly. Now, I am not positive. It might be SNES 9X. But one of them I saw does, in fact, correctly emulate the Super FX, and there's no glitches in the monsters. One of them had like little flickering glitches in the walls.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's the same bug.
From what I recall, one of the versions of SNES 9X did have the snowflake effect, but the ones that worked the best, in my recollection, are like BSNES and Hegan.
BSNES, yes.
Those also run the game in the correct frame rate, because some of them overclock the game. I've seen. It's really interesting, right?
Yes. Well, that's the nice thing about the emulators that are going to overclock the game. That once the source code gets released and people make their own versions, they can turn on the option that says don't do the pixel doubling for the walls.
Yeah.
And so the overclocked version will basically just have nice higher resolution graphics, and it will still run at a good frame rate, whereas the ones that are emulating the super effects more accurately will limit the frame rate, and so the game will be slower. So it's sort of a balance between what you want.
Steve Wayne asks, was there any earlier version of the cut levels and some of the cut music? Was there anything like that? Cut music?
Yes. As a matter of fact, the levels that were cut changed a number of times. Basically, what I did was I built all the levels and figured out which were the biggest ones and which were the most popular ones. And so it was a balance, because if I could cut one big level and fit two smaller levels in its place, that's a good trade-off, unless the big level, like I want to say E1M 3 or 4, it's one where there's this huge underground area, and it's such a well-known level that I couldn't really cut it, even though it was a big one and would have allowed two smaller levels in there. Same thing with the music. The music didn't take as much space as the levels, but we sort of cut down the music to the minimum so that we could have more space for the levels.
Yeah, so that's why some of the it was like in the second episode, the first level uses the secret level music of the first episode. It's like that's really interesting to see. But anyway, that's great to hear that so. Yeah, but anyway, wait. Any fun, interesting stories about your work during the development that you would like to share?
Actually, not really. There weren't any really big catastrophes or screw-ups or breakthroughs. The project really was sort of a labor of love for everybody working on it, and it was completed in a very tight timeline. Like I said, if there was one thing that was a little bit disappointing, it was when John Coffey had made all sorts of changes to the levels. He had edited the levels, and I think it made them much more playable. And id Software had said that they wanted us to stick with the original levels as they were, so I had to back out those changes, and I think that was sort of a disappointment. But we couldn't have done the project without all the people that were there. I mean, it really, there were, as you can see in the credits, there was a couple of dozen people that were involved in it, not just in the development of it, but in the sales and the marketing and the team that put together the manual. I remember seeing a prototype. You hear of prototype games, but I saw a prototype of the manual before it was printed, and it was very, very cool.
Yeah, it was like this like instruction, like "Welcome to Doom," on your feet, soldier, or something. It was really personalized or something.
Yeah, it was like almost like a comic book kind of.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I believe it's also only in the American version, because I have the Japanese version complete, and it also has a very cool manual. It has also some kind of thing. The last question Steve Wayne asks is, do you think it would be possible to port Die Flash Consumed on the Rage Reality engine?
I think so. As I said, since the engine supports most of the features in Doom, like the elevating stairs and the crushing walls and the transparency, and it supports the music, I think if somebody were to spend the time with the engine and just change the configuration files that are part of the source code dump, they can import any level that they want. They can import levels, they can import monsters. It's all fairly straightforward.
All right, and then as last he has to say to you, besides some of the shortcomings, I still to this day found very impressive work made by you for the SNES version. It was one of the few ports with the most content, and at the same time not using the Jaguar as a base. And he wants to thank you for that, and he doesn't think he would have been so interested in Doom without this port.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words and the compliments. I always work hard and try my best to really push the envelope for all of my projects, and it's a pleasure and an honor to hear that he likes my work, and I like hearing when people like my work. That it makes me feel good that I've done something.
Yeah, I would imagine that. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, and then next up, Gabe YT asks, my question for Randy: when you put the Easter eggs for your wife in the game, in the episode sky texture in a message, when did you think they would be found? Did you ever intend her to see it at one point, and are you still together with her?
Good question. I never intended anybody to ever see the Easter eggs, and I was very surprised when people had found them. Actually, the Easter egg that's along the very bottom of the texture is there because that texture has to be a certain dimension tall, and so I could have just filled it with black space, but instead I decided to fill it up with the characters that I did, with all the different colors and stuff, because you can't see it unless you use a no-clip cheat, or you're looking at the ROM itself.
Well, it was also a big coincidence that was found. It was just this guy called Retro Mike was no clipping in Doom. He found this like cheat, and then he went out of bounds, and he saw that, and it was like one of the biggest discoveries for the game back then, for the SNES game. So I believe that also sparked a lot of interest in the Super Nintendo version. And, hey, this one has a lot of things that needs to be known about it.
There's a lot of stuff that's neat about the engine. Because of the compression, because of the data formats, it's a little more difficult to play around with. But I think that releasing the code on GitHub is going to really help people see how everything fits together. I think it's going to answer a lot of questions about how certain things were done. And I'm looking forward to see what people do with it once they know, oh, this is what this byte means at this address, and this is the structure of this data, used in a level or a monster. And I think it'll be very exciting to see what people do with it.
The next question of TA on YouTube: have you ever met John Carmack when you sent your prototype to id Software? If so, do you have any words for him? You are both such great programmers.
Well, thank you for the compliment. That's very, very kind. I have never met John in person. As a matter of fact, I've never met anybody from id Software. Though I did speak with John a couple of times on the phone, and he's an absolute genius programmer, so it would be a pleasure to actually meet him. I have never met anybody else at id, and as I said, I only spoke to John once or twice on the telephone.
All right. So, and then there's another username. Which cut features of the original game did the engine originally support? Bobbing up or down, particles, different angles, or enemy sprites, ceiling or floor textures? It's already been answered partly, but maybe is there anything else?
Yeah, the engine did support different angles for the sprites, so that the monsters weren't always facing you. And it did floor and ceiling textures, but both of those had to come out for space limitations. The only objects that have multiple angles is the Doom player. Yeah. And you can only see that if you have an XBAND.
Why episode 2 was the one with the most cut levels, but
that's a good question. As I said, most of the levels were cut because of the size. And in level 2, there are some of the biggest levels that are there.
Yeah, expanding vats.
So that's one. Yes, any of the really big levels were cut because I could fit 2 or more levels in the space of just one. So unless it was a really, really popular, really infamous level.
Yeah.
Then that's why most of them came out of episode 2. But that's a good observation.
So he or she also asks, were you aware of other folks working on the other console versions? We also told a little bit about that, but is there anything still?
Well, I wasn't actually aware of any of the other console versions while I was working on the Super Nintendo one. I have since actually chatted with and hooked up with Rebecca Heineman, who did the 3DO version, and she's an awesome programmer. But other than her, I've never met anybody who worked on any of the other ports.
Yeah, the 3DO story is also very interesting. So if people who watch the video, I recommend check Rebecca Heineman's video about 3DO Doom. It's also very interesting.
Yes.
But anyway, the next question is, why was the original ending with the dead rabbit and the burning city cut?
It's a good question. It's like most cuts, the space in the ROM was really limited, and I chose to have as many levels as possible. So because of that, it was easier to cut endings and cut screens and intro screens to fit more levels in. Anything that wasn't essential, if I could cut it, then I did, so that way we could have more levels in the game.
All right, and here we have the question from Retro Mike, who found the Easter egg we've been talking about. He says, here are my questions. Did you know that your awesome Amiga port of Dragon's Lair has inspired the creator of Out of This World to use polygon graphics for his game cutscenes and gameplay scenes?
Yeah, I was very honored and humbled to hear Eric Chahi say that. He did a recorded speech for a game developer conference where he sort of described the whole creation of Another World and Out of This World, and he mentioned that he had seen Dragon's Lair on the Amiga and thought that I was using polygons, and actually I wasn't. And it inspired him to create Out of This World. And it's a tremendous honor to have had an influence to have had an influence on anybody in general, but particularly to have had an influence that caused such a tremendous game like Out of This World to be created. So yes, I wasn't aware until I had seen Eric Chahi's video. And I am very, very humbled by the role that Dragon's Lair played. I think Dragon's Lair was one of those, for software games, it was one of those points where it's like, wow, a computer can do full screen, full color animation with stereo sound. And this was long before the word streaming was something that what was common. Dragon's Lair streamed data off of the floppy disks while you were playing the game. So it was way ahead of its time on a technical level. Most people aren't aware that the whole program, the entire Dragon's Lair program, is 8K. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it comes on 6 floppy disks. So
yeah.
All of those floppy disks, all of it, it's all data.
Wow, that's
and the 8K
awesome.
program.
He also asks, I'm actually the person who discovered your Easter egg in the sky texture. Is there any other secrets that have yet to be found?
Well, first, congratulations on finding the secret. I did not expect anybody to ever see it, but this was back before there were emulators. When I was working on Doom for the Super FX, there weren't really emulators out there at the time. And there certainly weren't emulators that allowed you to poke around and look at things and change memory and do things like no clipping and so on. Unfortunately, there aren't any other hidden cheat codes or Easter eggs. There just actually wasn't enough space left in the ROM to add cheat codes, believe it or not. So you've managed to find all the Easter eggs that are there.
Well, that's awesome to hear. So the retro mic can rest easy on that.
Yes, yes.
In the French interview that I've uploaded a few years ago, he said, you said that you showed its software a prototype's version. By any chance, do you still own the older build of the port?
I probably have an older version somewhere. I've got a lot of old stuff that I'm actually working with a guy. His name is Alan Bindley, and he runs a retro gaming site, and it's a very famous one out of Ireland. And so I've been sending him a bunch of stuff for preservation, and I'm sure that I will come across it. It would be a version that there wouldn't be sound and there wouldn't be music, but there would be the status bar, and there may not be monsters, but the rest of the Doom world would be there.
Like also all the levels, or just E1M1?
Yes, and it was just E1M1.
Asks, why can't you circle strafe in the port?
It's a good question. You can sort of circle strafe, sort of.
Yeah, I believe he also switching between the shoulder buttons and the D-pad, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. With the shoulder buttons and the D-pad, you can sort of circle strafe. It's a limitation of the controller. The D-pad buttons are proper strafe left and right, and you can sort of toggle the D-pad left and right and forward and back, and flick the shoulder buttons to do a circle strafe. It doesn't quite feel the same, but it does work.
Yeah, it does work, but it was just like a memory thing, or yeah.
Yes, yeah. The controls are very simple. As I said, 95, maybe higher % of the code running is Super Effects, and the Super Effects doesn't have access to the Super Nintendo chips. Basically, the graphics chips, the sound chips, all of that is on the Super Nintendo side, and then there's a Super Effects side, and all it has access to is the ROM and some RAM. And so all of the logic that handles the controller is done on the Super Effects, on the Super Nintendo side. And it just basically tells the Super Effects what buttons have been pressed down. So it could have been implemented, but it wasn't as high an important feature as getting the rest of the game done. So that's predominantly why it isn't there.
He also asks, do you think a port of Doom 2 would be possible on the Super Nintendo using the Reality Engine, with all the big monsters like the Archvile and the Icon of Sin?
Yes. Because the engine handles pretty much all of the Doom requirements, and Doom 2 is very similar to Doom 1, if you can make the levels fit into the Doom 1 formats, then the tool chain that I'll be releasing on my GitHub page processes the levels. And so, yeah, I mean, I know I've seen yourself and another couple of hackers out there hack in Doom 2 style. It's very, very impressive.
Yeah,
I have to say, exceptionally impressive that people reverse engineered Doom for the Super Effects. And I think that a lot of the questions that people have will be answered when they get to actually see the source code and see what it looks like.
I'm very excited for it, and yeah, it's like it was very hard to like port levels with that reverse engineering stuff, because would crash because we don't really know a lot about it yet, and we will be soon. So
yes.
So, but it's amazing, yeah. From what I gather in your French interview, this port was first a fan project. Were you able to get the original source code from it when they green-lighted your port, or you had a better idea, about scripting or monster behavior, or did you do everything from scratch without even looking at it?
Everything was done independently without seeing the source code from id. So I had never seen the source code from id. I mostly used the Doom reference materials online, the Doom internals handbook and things like that described the data formats. And then from the data formats, I wrote tools in C that processed that data, but I had never seen the Doom source code when I was working on the port.
All right, Retro Mike goes to say, anyway, thank you so much, Mr. Linden, for this great port. Without it, I wouldn't have been able to play Doom since I only had a SNES back then. I'm still impressed by the fact that to this day, this is the only early port that tried to be as close to the PC version, while others were based on the Jaguar with missing features.
Well, thank you for the tremendous compliment. I really appreciate it. Like I said, a lot of my projects that I've worked on, even my latest one, Cyboid, it is a very small, high-speed 3D first-person shooter game, and the entire game fits in like 15 megabytes. I try to really push the envelope from a technical standpoint on all the things that I've worked on, and I'm glad that so many people really enjoyed Doom for the Super Effects, because it was exciting. It was exciting to be working on something that, not only had to have special hardware developed and special software developed, but there was a lot of companies that were involved and a lot of people, and it was a big project that in the end worked out really well. Awesome.
And anyway, the next person, Demon12321 asks, why did you pick the Super Nintendo as a platform for Doom?
As it turns out, I was, as I said, helping on the Dirt Tracks FX project. That was a project that was greenlit for publishing using the Super Effects. And while that was in development, I thought to myself, I now know enough about the Super Effects to say that I could build a Doom game with the Super Effects. And so I started to work on it because I had all the equipment available, I had the software available, I had the tools available, and it was most on all my spare time getting the thing to actually work.
And he also asked how much space was occupied by the multiplayer content. Was it possible to add one more map, like a multiplayer map or something?
It's a good question. The multiplayer content is mostly the different angles for the player, the different graphics. So if that were cut, there still wouldn't be enough to add one more level unless it was a really small one. Because, as I said, it's mostly just the different angles for the Doom guy. That takes up more space than the code for the XBAND, than the code for the multiplayer support itself.
Yeah, alright. And also, Mark W6 asks, question for Randy. How were the music and sound effects made and composed? I'm really curious about how Doom's music works on the SNES.
Actually, the music and sound engine was written by Sculptured Software. I didn't do that.
Okay.
I did write a tool to convert the MIDI soundtracks because the Doom music was MIDI based, and it had instrument samples for the Gravis ultrasound. And so I wrote a tool that converted that into the format that the Super NES used, and that worked with sculptured sound drivers. So the sounds and instruments were similar, because they came from the original source on the PC, but they weren't identical.
That is it. Those are all the questions. So finally, I would like to ask you how, what can we expect more from you? Like you said, Cyboid and.
Yeah, I'm working at Cyboid. You can either go to cyboid.app or my company, which is R&R Digital, so RANDR digital.com. Cyboid is a 3D first-person shooter. If you sort of think Quake 2 in the back of your mind, but it runs on low-end, low-powered devices like Amazon Fire TV Stick. It runs on Android phones, tablets, Android TV. It's got 10 or 11 levels, and it's got 4 or 5 monsters and 6 or 7 items, and it has the first 4 levels for free, so you can play the game and see if you like it. It supports game controllers and touchpad. It supports all sorts of neat stuff like that, and there's no advertising. So it's a lot of fun, and as I said, the entire thing fits into about 15 megabytes, which is tiny. Very tiny.
So it's like the philosophy you used in SNES Doom is also carried over to Cyboid, and that's so amazing. I gotta say.
Yes.
Well, anyway, Randy, thank you so much for doing this interview with me. It's a big honor, and I loved playing Super Nintendo Doom when I started getting in the whole retro game collecting thing 10 years ago, and it always amazed me. And I'm sure the fans will be super happy with this. So
wonderful! My pleasure. I'm tremendously honored, and like I said, offline, send me your address, and I'll send you a special care package.
Yeah,
all sorts of goodies.
All right. So anyway, Randy, this will conclude the interview. And if you do you have anything to say to the fans still?
No, thank you for your support. I do this because I love doing it, and I love hearing from the fans. So thank you again for all your support and for the compliments. I'm truly humbled, and I will keep working hard to try and impress people.
All right, and by that we'll end this interview. Thank you so very much, Randy.
You're very welcome. Have a great day.
Yes, you too.
Thanks.